The 1930 Tariff and the commercial war that followed were a critical factor in the rise of Hitler in Germany. That warning comes from economist Charles Kindleberger. He wasn't claiming that one American law automatically produced fascism. He was saying something more sobering. When the United States, the dominant economic force of the era, slammed the door on global trade and triggered a chain reaction, the damage didn't stay inside U.S. borders. Trade collapsed. Banks failed. Tens of millions of people were thrown into fear and instability. And in that fear, radical movements that once sat on the margins suddenly began to look like real answers. To understand how we got there, we have to start in the 1920s. The United States in that decade is remembered as the Roaring Twenties. On the surface, the nickname made perfect sense. Output surged, new industries exploded, cities swelled, and modern consumer life took shape. Radios, cars, refrigerators, and other manufactured goods were no longer luxuries for the rich. They were working and middle-class products. People were buying on credit. The stock market kept setting new highs. U.S. GDP growth across the decade averaged around 4.2% a year, which is extremely fast for a developed industrial economy. Corporate leaders talked as if prosperity had finally become permanent. The country looked like the engine of global prosperity, but those headline numbers hid deep fault lines. Wealth was concentrating at the top. Household and corporate debt were piling up. A lot of the boom was built on speculation and leverage instead of stability. And one of the most politically important groups in the country was already under intense financial pressure even before the famous 1929 crash: farmers. That matters because farming carried very different political weight in 1929 than it does today. Right now, people working in agriculture make up maybe 6.5% of the U.S. population. Back then, it was close to 20%. In other words, farmers weren't some niche interest group. They were a massive voting bloc. During World War I, American farmers had been treated like the people feeding democracy. Large parts of Europe simply could not grow enough food. Farmland in places like France and Belgium was scarred by artillery and trench warfare. Fields lay abandoned or occupied. Millions of European men, who would normally be planting and harvesting, were in uniform at the front. So, the Allies turned to the United States. American farmers heard, "The world needs you," and they acted. They borrowed aggressively. They bought more land. They invested in modern machinery. They planted every acre they could. Prices were high, demand seemed limitless, and banks were happy to lend. Farming felt not just profitable, but heroic. Then the war ended, and the reality flipped. Europe gradually rebuilt its farmland, brought soldiers back to the fields, and restarted normal agricultural production. That meant Europe didn't need U.S. grain and meat at emergency levels anymore. Imports from the United States dropped. Global crop prices fell hard. And now, American farmers were stuck in a brutal trap. They had taken on huge debts to expand during the wartime boom, but the income they needed to service those debts collapsed. The mortgage payment on 100 new acres didn't shrink just because the price of wheat fell. The bill for that new tractor didn't go away just because corn had crashed. Families who had borrowed to feed the Allies were now staring at foreclosure. By the late 1920s, this wasn't just a few unlucky homesteads. Farm auctions and foreclosures were spreading across the Midwest and the Plains. Communities that had recently been praised as the backbone of America suddenly felt abandoned. So farmers organized. Agricultural unions, co-ops, and lobbying groups went on offense. They flooded Washington with letters. They showed up in person. They held protests. Their demand was simple and direct: raise tariffs on imported farm goods. In plain language, they wanted the federal government to make foreign agricultural products more expensive at the U.S. border, so that American-grown crops could sell at a higher price. Herbert Hoover listened. Hoover ran for president in 1928 as a Republican, and he understood perfectly well how large, organized, and angry the farm vote was. On the campaign trail, he promised that, if elected, he would fight for higher tariffs on agricultural imports. He said Washington had a duty to shield American farmers from unfair foreign competition. That wasn't a throwaway applause line. That was a core promise. Rural America heard it and expected him to deliver. Before we go any farther, let's pause on what a tariff actually is, because this one word drives the rest of the story. A tariff is a tax a government places on goods coming in from abroad. Picture this. The United States puts a tariff on Canadian maple syrup. The Canadian producer doesn't send a check to Washington. Instead, the American company importing that syrup pays the tariff when the shipment crosses the border. Politicians and industry groups who support tariffs frame this as protection. By making foreign products more expensive, they argue, you give domestic producers a fighting chance. You save local jobs. But here's the part politicians rarely like to say out loud. The importer that just paid that tariff almost never quietly absorbs the cost. They raise the price they charge. That higher price flows to the distributor or the retailer, and in the end, it lands on the shelf, which means the final buyer, regular people in the country that impose the tariff, usually ends up paying more. So tariffs are often sold as help for domestic workers, but in practice they often function as higher prices for domestic consumers. That tension between the story and the reality is important, and it's still at the center of every modern tariff debate. Now, the timing. Hoover won the election, and almost immediately the broader economy began to crack. The Federal Reserve, worried that Wall Street had turned into a dangerous speculative bubble, started raising interest rates in early 1928 to cool the frenzy. Higher rates made borrowing more expensive and slowed the flow of easy credit. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. That crash didn't just wipe out speculators, it wrecked public confidence, damaged bank balance sheets, and pushed businesses to cut back. What had looked like a slowdown turned into a serious recession that was on its way to becoming the Great Depression. Hoover walked straight into that storm. He had barely taken office. Banks were shaky. Industrial production was falling. Farmers were drowning in debt and running out of buyers. He needed to show action, fast, especially to the rural voters he had promised to defend. So he called Congress into a special session and pushed for higher tariffs. His initial goal was fairly narrow: raise tariffs on agricultural imports, lift farm prices, and stabilize the countryside. If the story had ended there, this would mostly be a chapter in the history of farm policy. It didn't end there. In Congress, two Republicans drove the process: Willis Hawley, who chaired the House Ways and Means Committee, and Reed Smoot, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee. Both men were committed protectionists. They didn't just want to boost tariffs on farm goods, they wanted to raise tariffs on a long list of imported items: machinery, textiles, chemicals, manufactured goods in general. Industry lobbyists loved that approach. If farmers were about to get trade protection, everyone else wanted in. The bill ballooned. By the time the dust settled, it wasn't just an agricultural relief bill anymore. It had become the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a sweeping economy-wide attempt to wall off U.S. producers from foreign competition. Protectionists sold it as patriotism: keep production in America, keep wages in America, stop dumping from abroad. And they had precedent to point to. The United States had already passed a high tariff in 1922 that averaged around 40%, and the American economy still roared afterward. So their pitch was simple: we've done this before, and we were fine. Let's do it again, even bigger. Not everyone agreed. A coalition of progressive Republicans and most Democrats tried to block or shrink the bill. Their argument sounded technical at the time, but it turned out to be exactly right. If the United States raised tariffs on everyone else would raise tariffs on the United States. Foreign governments would retaliate. They would hit American exports with tariffs of their own. That would choke off sales for U.S. factories that depended on foreign customers. And once those export markets disappeared, American plants would have to cut production and lay people off. Remember, in 1930, the United States wasn't just a buyer. It was also a major exporter of industrial goods and farm goods. Opponents of the bill used every tool available. They spoke for months. They filed amendment after amendment to slow the process. What was supposed to pass in a few weeks dragged on for more than a year. But, politically, protect American jobs is easier to sell during a crisis than protect global trade flows. The economy was already trembling. Fear was everywhere. Protectionists leaned into that fear and gained ground. Eventually, the bill cleared both chambers of Congress anyway. The Senate approved it by a razor-thin 44-42 vote. The House backed it 222-153. With that, the decision reached Herbert Hoover's desk. He now had to choose between his campaign promise and the flood of warnings arriving from economists and foreign governments. And there were a lot of warnings. Europe in 1930 was still unstable after World War I. Germany especially was fragile. After the war, the new German government, the Weimar Republic, had been forced to accept huge reparations payments. To make those payments and to keep its currency from melting down again after the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, Germany leaned heavily on loans from American banks. In plain terms, U.S. money was keeping parts of Germany's economy alive. That made Germany extremely vulnerable to any shock in U.S. policy or finance. If the American banking system panicked and pulled its loans, or if global trade suddenly seized up, Germany would be in serious trouble. Other countries understood the danger immediately and said so. By late 1929, formal diplomatic protests against the proposed tariff increases had arrived in Washington from 23 nations. Canada, America's largest trading partner, made it very clear that if the United States raised tariffs, Canada would respond with counter-tariffs. Spain, Switzerland, and Italy threatened outright boycotts of American goods. Several European governments warned that if the U.S. shut them out, they would shut the U.S. out. That kind of coordinated pushback during peacetime was almost unheard of. It was the rest of the world saying, if you start a trade war, we will meet you on that field. Inside the United States, experts were sounding alarms too. Paul Douglas, a Chicago economist who would later become a U.S. senator, organized a petition urging Hoover to veto the bill. About 1,000 economists signed it. Their message to the White House was blunt. If you sign this, you will trigger retaliation abroad, crush American exports, raise prices at home, and turn a severe recession into a global catastrophe. They weren't guessing. They were describing in advance what would now look obvious. Hoover could have vetoed the bill and demanded something narrower. He didn't. On June 17, 1930, Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law. With that single signature, the United States effectively declared a trade war on much of the world. The reaction was immediate. Countries retaliated exactly as they had promised. They imposed tariffs on U.S. goods. They blocked American products, so international trade began to freeze. U.S. imports plunged from around $7 billion in 1929 to about $2.5 billion in 1932. Total global trade fell by roughly 65%. And this collapse hit while the United States was already reeling from the Wall Street crash and a spreading banking crisis. Instead of helping the U.S. economy recover, the tariff shock helped shut off one of the few remaining escape valves. The fallout at home landed first on the people the tariffs were supposed to save. With other countries slamming the door on U.S. crops, American farm exports fell by more than 30% between 1929 and 1933. Farmers who had begged Washington for protection now watched their foreign customers disappear. Their debt didn't disappear, their income did. Then industry felt the blow. Overseas buyers stopped ordering American machinery, vehicles, and industrial goods because their governments had made those imports more expensive through retaliation, or were boycotting outright. Factories in export-dependent towns slowed to a crawl or went dark. Workers were laid off by the millions. In many industrial cities, the constant sound of production, which had defined the 1920s, simply died. The unemployment that began with the 1929 crash deepened and spread into nearly every corner of the country. Meanwhile, in Germany, the economic shock turned into something even more dangerous: political collapse. As American banks scrambled to protect themselves at home, they called in loans from Germany. German credit evaporated. German banks failed. German companies collapsed. Unemployment in Germany exploded from roughly 3 million people in 1929 to more than 6 million in 1932, close to 30% of the entire workforce. Think about that. Nearly 1 out of every 3 workers had no job, no income, and no realistic path forward. That's not just hardship, that's national desperation. That desperation created an opening. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, had been a fringe movement for most of the 1920s. In the 1928 elections, it pulled only about 2.6% of the national vote. Almost nobody in mainstream German politics saw it as a serious governing force. But by 1932, after years of unemployment anger, humiliation, and fear. The Nazis had surged to become Germany's largest political party. Their message was brutally simple. Germany had been betrayed, enemies were everywhere, and only a hardline nationalist project could restore pride and order. In January 1933, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preparing to take office in the United States, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. It would be misleading to say Smoot-Hawley caused Hitler by itself. German nationalism, anger over the Treaty of Versailles, anti-Semitism, elite maneuvering, and the failures of moderate leaders all played huge roles. But the tariff shock and the retaliatory trade war made everything worse at the exact wrong moment. They helped turn a deep recession into a full social breakdown inside a fragile democracy. When people become desperate enough, they start listening to voices that promise absolute solutions and absolute enemies. That is the uncomfortable part of Kindleberger's argument. Back in the United States, the political cost for Hoover was brutal. By 1932, the Great Depression was undeniable. Banks were collapsing. Bread lines stretched through major cities. Confidence in his leadership had basically vanished. Hoover ran for re-election against Franklin Delano Roosevelt and lost decisively. And it wasn't just Hoover who paid. The two men most associated with the tariff, Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley, both lost their seats. Voters delivered a clear verdict on protectionism. Roosevelt came in promising a New Deal. Most people remember the New Deal for jobs programs, banking reform, and new social protections. But there was also a decisive shift in trade strategy. Instead of doubling down on blanket tariffs, Roosevelt's administration pursued negotiated trade agreements that lowered specific barriers in exchange for access. Congress even gave the White House broad authority to cut tariffs in bilateral deals. Over the following decades, that approach evolved into something bigger, a rules-based international trading system. After World War II, the United States helped build a framework of agreements and institutions, the forerunners of what later became institutions like the World Trade Organization, designed to keep trade flowing and prevent every disagreement from exploding into a tariff war. The idea was to replace ad hoc retaliation with predictable rules. That model carried forward into the late 20th century. The U.S. signed broad agreements such as NAFTA and built supply chains that crossed borders. Supporters said this delivered cheaper goods to U.S. consumers and opened foreign markets to American companies. Critics said it hollowed out industrial regions, killed union jobs, and pushed factories to lower-wage countries. Both views contain truth. Free trade increased overall national output and corporate profit, but it also left deep scars in specific towns. Those towns vote. They feel ignored. They are angry. That anger is one reason tariffs are back in mainstream U.S. politics. Recent Liberation Day-style tariff plans have been pitched as a way to punish foreign competitors, rebuild American manufacturing, and take back control. The markets did not react calmly. In one episode, roughly $4 trillion in market value disappeared in just a few days after sweeping tariff proposals were announced. Under pressure, there was a temporary 90-day pause on parts of those global tariffs, so investors could breathe. At the same time, the United States has escalated a trade confrontation with China. That fight is complicated because American companies depend on Chinese-made components, electronics, machinery, and materials. Tariffs don't erase that dependence. They just raise the cost of it for U.S. businesses and, ultimately, for U.S. consumers. Economists today are once again offering the same kind of warnings we heard in 1930. Back then, about 1,000 economists begged Hoover not to sign Smoot-Hawley. Now, in 2025, leading economists in the United States and abroad are warning that broad, headline-grabbing tariffs could ignite a modern trade war, drive up prices for American families, and destabilize allies whose political systems are already under pressure. And here's the difference. The world in 2025 is even more tightly connected than the world of 1930. Our supply chains run through multiple countries at once. Critical inputs for American technology, medicine, energy, and infrastructure are sourced globally. Financial markets move capital across the planet in seconds. That means the shock from a major tariff war today would spread even faster and possibly hit even harder than it did in 1930. And that brings us back to Kindleberger's point. Tariffs are not just technical policy tweaks, they are force multipliers. Smoot-Hawley began as a promise to protect American farmers. It became a sweeping wall of protectionism. It triggered retaliation from America's trading partners. It helped shrink global trade by roughly 2/3. It deepened the Great Depression. And in the chaos that followed, Germany, a fragile democracy that depended on economic stability to survive, fell into the hands of Adolf Hitler. That is the lesson. When a major country slams its economy behind tariff walls during a period of stress, the damage does not stop at higher prices in stores. It can fracture alliances, shut down credit, create mass unemployment abroad, and open the door for movements built on anger, revenge, and absolutism. The distance from economic pain to political extremism is shorter than most people think. So, here's the question. Do sweeping tariffs today mostly promise a healthy revival of American industry, or do they risk replaying a cycle we've already seen? Retaliation, financial panic, and the rise of dangerous politics in places pushed past the breaking point. Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you made it all the way here, drop a $sign emoji so I know you stayed to the end. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the deep dives on the Roaring '20s and on the Great Depression for more context.